May 7, 1945, Reims, France. 2:41 a.m. Floodlights turn a cramped, map-lined classroom into a white-hot box of heat and shadow. The air tastes like stale coffee and cigarette ash. Boots scuff on old-school flooring as men who command continents stare at a single sheet of paper on a long black-topped table. If you're new here, take a second to support this channel, hit like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who loves history told like a documentary, not a textbook. And tell us where you're watching from. A city, a country, a base, a late-night living room. These stories happened in real places, to real people, and tonight, we're stepping into one of them. 3 German officers enter under the glare, their heels clicking out a rhythm that feels borrowed from a world already dead. The Allies do not rise to greet them. No smiles, no nods, no ritual respect. And in that hard, breathless moment, Germany's last gamble becomes obvious. This is not a negotiation at all. It is an arrest performed with ink. The town of Reims had survived by seeming ordinary. A cathedral city in the Champagne region, scarred by war, now hosting the nerve center of the largest coalition army in history. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force SHAEF had moved into a red brick technical school, a building meant for lectures and workshops, not the last act of the Third Reich. One American in that building understood the strangeness of it better than any general. Master Sergeant Louis Graziano, a maintenance foreman attached to the Special Headquarters Command, had spent days fixing what war wore down lights, rooms, doors, the small practical parts of a machine that never slept. He had landed on Omaha Beach, survived the bulge, and now found himself maintaining the little red schoolhouse where the war's ending would be staged like a grim school lesson for the defeated. Outside, the war was still exhaling. German units were collapsing, surrendering by the tens of thousands, or fighting their way west in the last frantic hope of avoiding Soviet captivity. Inside SHAEF, the mood was not triumph. It was something heavier, administrative, wary, almost clinical, because everyone in that building knew Germany's leaders were still trying to shape the terms of their own death. By May 1945, Hitler was gone, but the Reich had not vanished like smoke. Adolf Hitler killed himself on April 30th, leaving behind not peace, but a vacuum that ambitious men rushed to fill. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz took what remained of authority and tried to turn surrender into strategy, saving soldiers, saving civilians, saving a fragment of leverage by choosing who Germany would yield to and who it'd keep fighting. It was a plan built on geography and fear. To the west stood Americans and British with food, cigarettes, and prisoner cages. To the east stood the Red Army, hardened by annihilation warfare, carrying memories of burned villages and mass graves across a front that had devoured entire generations. Germany's new leadership wanted to surrender in the west while delaying in the east, letting divisions and refugees flood toward Allied lines like water seeking a lower place. Eisenhower had heard it all before, because the last year of war had been full of German miracles that were really just delays. Every fortress city that fell, every last-ditch counterattack that burned fuel Germany could not replace, every promise of a wonder weapon that arrived too late or never arrived at all. And behind those delays, there was always the same truth. Germany was starving, not just for men, but for oil. Oil was the hidden arithmetic of victory. Germany's war machine ran on fuel it did not truly possess, dependent on imports. Captured fields, and synthetic production that could be bombed into ruin. When the Allies finally committed to smashing German petroleum production, the results were catastrophic for the Wehrmacht. Between May 1944 and May 1945, Allied air forces launched 651 attacks against German oil targets and dropped 208,566 tons of bombs, an industrial beating that turned movement into paralysis. The collapse was measurable, like a dying pulse on a chart. German pulp production fell from an average of 316,000 tons in April 1944 to 17,000 tons in September, about a 95% reduction. Aviation gasoline from synthetic plants dropped from 175,000 tons in April to 5,000 tons in September, gutting pilot training in air defense at the worst possible moment. The Reich still had soldiers. It still had tanks on paper. But the lifeblood was gone. Germany had tried to cheat physics with chemistry. At peak in early 1944, the synthetic fuels effort produced more than 124,000 barrels per day from 25 plants, and it supplied the overwhelming share of aviation gasoline the Luftwaffe needed. When the bombers made those plants unworkable, the war did not end with a single dramatic collapse. It ended with thousands of small immobilizations, grounded aircraft, stalled convoys, training flights canceled, engines silent. So by May 1945, Germany's last strategy was no longer military. It was diplomatic theater trying to make surrender look like a bargain between professionals, not a confession by criminals. And for that theater, Dönitz needed an actor with rank, confidence, and the authority to sign. Colonel General Alfred Jodl arrived as that actor. He had been Chief of Operations Staff of the German Armed Forces High Command, a central figure in the machinery of Nazi war. He came to Reims with his aide, Major Wilhelm Oxenius, joining Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedberg, another man trying to keep Germany's collapse orderly enough to be useful. The room prepared for them was brutally plain. A 30 by 30 foot space lined with operational maps, with a long black top table lit by floodlights that made the air almost insufferable. About 60 spectators gathered, delegates, technicians, and correspondents watching the final paperwork of a war that had torn the world open. Even the waiting was tense. Nervous smiles flickered and died against the map-lined walls. And Eisenhower did not go in. That absence was not convenience. It was intent. Eisenhower refused to meet the Germans until the surrender had been accomplished, delegating the signing to his chief of staff, Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith. The message was simple. The Supreme Commander would not sit at a table with men who still wanted to perform dignity. They would sign first. Then, and only then, would they be permitted into his presence. Smith was the perfect instrument for that mood. Not theatrical, not sentimental. A man shaped by deadlines, casualty reports, and the cold weight of responsibility. Where diplomats might have offered face-saving gestures, Smith offered procedure. The war had produced enough speeches. Now it would end in forms and signatures. The German delegation had already tested the water. Friedberg and earlier envoys tried to push partial terms, suggesting the Western Front could be surrendered while the Eastern Front continued, painting it as a humanitarian necessity. The answer from Schaeff was unbending: unconditional surrender on all fronts, East and West, simultaneously. There would be no separate peace, no clever partitioning of defeat. That insistence was not just moral. It was strategic insurance. The alliance holding the war together was fragile by nature. Americans, British, Soviets, and Free French bound by necessity, not affection. A German attempt to surrender only in the West was a knife aimed at that unity. Eisenhower understood that if the Nazis could crack the coalition at the moment of victory, they would poison the peace that followed. So the surrender at Reims became a controlled environment, like a quarantine room for a dying regime. The Germans were guarded, escorted, contained. They could wash, eat, sleep, but they could not direct the tempo. Time itself, every hour, every minute belonged to the Allies now. In those hours, the sensory texture of the schoolhouse mattered. Maps on walls marking the shrinking shape of German-held ground. Ashtrays filling faster than they could be emptied. Coffee turning bitter as it cooled in cups touched and forgotten. People glancing at clocks not because they doubted the outcome, but because they feared some last-minute complication would drag the war's ending into another day of killing. When Jodl arrived, he carried the posture of a system that had trained its officers to believe in hierarchy as destiny. He walked into the war room first, followed by Friedberg and Oxenius, and clicked his heels toward Smith. There was no saluting from the Allies, only the steady stare of men who had watched too much death to perform politeness. The Allied signatures were ready. Britain, the Soviet Union, France as witness, the Americans. The coalition that Germany had tried to split united at a school table under floodlights. On paper, the world was becoming a new shape. At 2:41 a.m. European time, the surrender documents were signed, and the ceremony start to finish lasted exactly 20 minutes. The actual signing itself took about 5 minutes. It was almost absurd how quickly ink could end what artillery had not. The surrender did not mean the guns stopped instantly. The instrument set the cessation of active operations at 2,301 hours Central European time on May 8th. The war's ending had to be transmitted across shattered communications, through units still fighting, through soldiers still dying in pockets of chaos. Even the final act of peace required logistics. Jodl, pale-faced, stood after signing and pleaded for generosity toward the German people and armed forces, words crafted to invoke shared suffering, as if the architects of aggression could now claim the language of victims. In the room, the plea hung briefly, then fell flat, absorbed by the same silence that had greeted his entrance. This was the moment where many stories would end, with the signature as the final image. But the real heart of this story is what happened next after the ceremony, after the flashbulbs, after Jodl's pen left the paper. Because there was still one door in the schoolhouse that mattered more than the surrender table. 10 minutes after the signing, Jodl was brought before Eisenhower. The Supreme Commander waited in a small office described like a cubbyhole, separated from the war room spectacle. Eisenhower stood behind his desk, grim and rigid, not sitting like a man ready to bargain. For Graziano, watching the movement of bodies through corridors, it felt less like a victory lap and more like an inspection, one last check to ensure the beast was truly dead. Jodl clicked his heels again on entering. This time, the sound carried a strange desperation, a reflex from a world where gestures could still command respect. Eisenhower had made his position clear long before Reims. After the surrender of Axis forces in Tunisia in May 1943, Eisenhower had declared he would not shake hands with a Nazi. That line was not a mood. It was policy. In a traditional officer's universe, the handshake is a bridge to professionals acknowledging that war is a duty, not a crime. It says, "You fought, I fought. Now we close the ledger and remain men of honor." Eisenhower understood that symbolism, and that is why he refused it. He would not allow the Third Reich to reframe itself as a defeated but respectable opponent. Not after the camps. Not after the civilians. Not after the deliberate machinery of terror that had followed German armies across Europe. Eisenhower's questions were cold and minimal, stripped of ceremony. Only confirmation that Jodl understood the terms, and a warning that he would be held personally accountable if the surrender was violated. Then the dismissal, short, final, almost indifferent. The Supreme Commander was not granting Jodl a place in history as a colleague. He was closing a file. Jodl saluted. Eisenhower stared in silence, a dismissal without theatrics. The war did not end with a roar. It ended with a man being denied the small comfort of being treated like an equal. And in that denial was the moral verdict the Allies wanted the world to remember. As the Germans left, the building's bright cables and floodlights tools of documentation became part of the humiliation. Jodl tripped on a camera floodlight cable while striding out, as if the physical world itself refused to let him exit with composure. The click of heels became a stumble. The posture became a mistake. The perfect ending for a regime that had tried to choreograph history and failed. In nearby rooms, the mood loosened, but not into pure joy. Even when champagne appeared later, it did not erase exhaustion. K. Summersby, Eisenhower's driver and assistant, remembered weariness more than celebration, a dull bitterness, the drained look of people who had carried too much too long. They had won, but the cost sat in their shoulders and under their eyes. And then there was the message. Staff officers drafted more elaborate wording, the kind of grand language nations expect at the close of a global war. Eisenhower rejected it. The words he sent to the combined chiefs of staff were as spare as a military report, because that is what the moment required. The mission was complete. Nothing could be added that would bring the dead back. The mission of this Allied force was fulfilled at 0241 local time, May 7, 1945. A line so simple it feels like understatement, and that was exactly the point. After years of Nazi propaganda and grandiose promises, the end came in a sentence that refused drama. Not victory as spectacle, victory as fact. For the wider world, the surrender would become VE Day celebrations, crowds and streets. Bells, flags, laughter that sounded like relief breaking through. But inside the Red Schoolhouse, the atmosphere was almost antiseptic. The Allies had learned a hard lesson. Endings are dangerous. A war can still kill on the day it dies, and Reims, in truth, was not the final curtain. The Soviet Union objected quickly. Moscow feared the Reims document looked like a separate piece, and Soviet representatives argued the surrender should be repeated in Berlin. In the conquered German capital, with the highest German military leaders present, the Allies agreed. So Germany surrendered twice, Reims in the early hours of May 7th and Berlin on May 8th. That second surrender in Berlin-Karlshorst carried a different temperature. Where Reims felt procedural and controlled, Berlin felt like a reckoning. The Red Army wanted the world to see where the war had truly been bled out on the Eastern Front, in ruins, in the shadow of a capital they had taken by force. Reims ended the fighting. Berlin sealed the narrative. And yet it is the handshake that lingers. Because the handshake was never about manners, it was about memory. Eisenhower understood that wars do not only end on battlefields. They end in the stories nations tell afterward: who was guilty, who was honorable, who deserved sympathy, who deserved trial. If Eisenhower had shaken Jodl's hand, the image could have been used like a bandage over a wound that was not clean. It could have implied equivalence where there was none. The refusal was a line drawn in the air between two kinds of conflict. There are wars between states, where soldiers fight and then go home. And there are wars of ideology and extermination, where the battlefield follows civilians into their homes, their synagogues, their villages, their last hiding places. Eisenhower's silence said the Third Reich belonged to the second category and would be treated accordingly. The aftermath proved that this was not theater. Jodl was arrested, tried at Nuremberg, convicted of war crimes, and executed by hanging on October 16, 1946. The pen that signed surrender did not purchase mercy. It only recorded defeat. Friedberg's end came even sooner suicide after the collapse of Donitz's short-lived Flensburg government. Once it became clear there would be no negotiated continuation of Nazi authority under a new name. The Reich's remnants dissolved into custody, trials, prisons, and history's long shadow. Dönitz himself would not bargain his way into legitimacy. He was arrested and later sentenced to prison time, a final proof that the Allies were not interested in preserving a clean German command structure as a shield against the Soviets. The war was over, but the moral accounting was just beginning. Eisenhower walked away from Reims not as a triumphant conqueror in the old style, but as a man trying to end something without letting it be rewritten. He posed for photos later, held up the pens, gave the public the image it needed. But in the private office, the crucial moment was not a smile, it was refusal. And perhaps that is why this story still matters. Because the end of Nazi Germany was not only the end of a military campaign. It was the beginning of a post-war world that needed new rules, rules that said aggression would not be rewarded with dignity. And crimes against humanity would not be washed clean by professional courtesies. The handshake would have been easy. The refusal required clarity. Back in that schoolhouse corridor, the air still smelled of smoke and heat from the lights. The maps on the walls still marked front lines that would soon be erased. And Master Sergeant Graziano, a man whose job was to keep the building working, witnessed the strange truth of modern war. The most powerful weapon in the room was not a gun. It was a closed hand. The world remembers the surrender as a date. It remembers VE Day as celebration. But inside Reims, the ending came with a quieter sound, the scratch of a pen, the click of heels, and then silence as the Supreme Commander refused to touch the hand of the regime he helped destroy. History does not always deliver justice in perfect form, but sometimes, for a single second, it delivers something close, an unmistakable signal that evil will not be granted the comfort of respect. And that is why Eisenhower did not shake hands.